This is the story of how a remote jungle city in the middle of the Amazon became one of the richest places on Earth. A place where rubber barons lit cigars with $100 bills, watered their horses with French champagne, and shipped their dirty laundry across the Atlantic to be washed in Paris. This is the story of the Manaus rubber boom. So how did Manaus become the Paris of the tropics? You have to go back to a kitchen accident. In 1839, a man named Charles Goodyear accidentally dropped a mixture of rubber and sulfur onto a hot stovetop. The substance charred like leather but stayed elastic, and that happy accident led to vulcanization, a process that transformed the sticky, unstable white sap of the Amazonian hevea tree into one of the most important industrial materials on Earth. Suddenly, rubber could be used for hoses, gaskets, belts, and eventually tires. The Industrial Revolution was hungry for it, and there was only one place on the planet where it grew: the Amazon basin. By 1855, over 2,000 tons of rubber were being exported from the Amazon. By 1879, that number had surged to 10,000 tons, and as the rubber flowed out, money poured in. Unimaginable money. At its peak, the Amazon region was responsible for nearly 40% of all of Brazil's exports. Rubber alone made up a quarter of the country's total export revenue by the 1900s. The per capita income of Manaus ran twice as high as São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, the wealthy coffee-producing powerhouses of southeastern Brazil. GDP per capita in the Brazilian Amazon jumped from $49 in 1840 to $323 at the boom's peak in 1910, and most of that wealth concentrated in one city: Manaus. A city of only 40,000 people that built an electric grid designed for 1 million. It was the first city in Brazil to have streetcars with 16 miles of track, and the second to have electric lighting. It had a telephone system before most European capitals had finished installing theirs, and it became, bizarrely, the world capital for diamond sales. Per capita diamond consumption in Manaus was the largest on the planet. Men walked with canes topped in gold and silver. Children were sent to school in Paris or Lausanne. Nearly 2,500 residents bought first-class steamship tickets to Europe every single year. And then there was the Opera House. The Teatro Amazonas is perhaps the single most absurd symbol of the rubber boom's excess. Proposed in 1881 by a local politician, construction began in 1884 and cost $10 million of public money. The roofing tiles were imported from Alsace. The steel walls came from Glasgow. The stairs, statues, and columns were carved from Italian Carrara marble. The dome was covered in 36,000 ceramic tiles painted in the colors of the Brazilian flag. Inside, 198 chandeliers hung from the ceilings, including 32 pieces of Murano glass imported directly from Italy. The main curtain was painted in Paris, depicting the meeting of the Amazon and Rio Negro rivers, and the cobblestones outside the entrance were coated in a thick layer of rubber to muffle the sound of horse hooves, just in case guests arrived after the performance had already begun. It opened on December 31, 1896. The first proper performance, on January 7, 1897, was the Italian opera La Gioconda. Rubber barons and their wives arrived in furs, sweating in the tropical heat, because that was the fashion in Europe and they refused to be outdone. In one visiting opera season, half the members of a touring troupe died of yellow fever. The show apparently went on. The historian Robin Furneaux captured it perfectly. No extravagance, however absurd, deterred the rubber barons. If one rubber baron bought a vast yacht, another would install a tame lion in his villa, and a third would water his horse on champagne. Consider the rubber baron Waldemar Schultz, who lived in a 26-room palace on the Avenida 7 de Setembro with his English ex-showgirl wife. A fleet of Bugattis sat in the driveway. His motorboat and yacht held pride of place at the dock. A pet lion, imported from Europe, was chained in the garden, and his laundry was sent to Paris for washing because, legend has it, the water of the Rio Negro was simply too dark and dirty. At the height of the boom, champagne reportedly cost less than water in Manaus. Champagne arrived in bulk. Clean water had to be purified. But underneath all that glitter was horror. The rubber barons' fortunes were built on forced labor, and in many cases, outright slavery. Thousands of indigenous men, women, and children were worked to death or murdered by overseers when they failed to meet their quotas. About 30,000 rubber workers died in the Amazon from malaria, yellow fever, hepatitis, and animal attacks. They called the rubber white gold, and it consumed them. The most horrific case was the Putumayo genocide. The Peruvian rubber baron Julio Cesar Arjona operated along the Putumayo River during the first decade of the 1900s. His Peruvian Amazon company enslaved indigenous populations, subjecting the Huitoto, Bora, and Andoque peoples to forced labor, starvation, torture, and mass killings. In 12 years, the native population along the Putumayo collapsed from over 30,000 to fewer than 8,000, while Arjona exported over 4,000 tons of rubber and earned more than $75 million. One plantation started with 50,000 natives. When investigators finally reached it, only 8,000 were still alive. It wasn't until Roger Casement, the same man who had exposed atrocities in the Congo, filed a scathing report that the world began to pay attention. But by then, the boom was already dying for an entirely different reason. In 1876, a British explorer named Henry Wickham collected 70,000 rubber seeds from commercial groves in Brazil. He declared them to customs officials as, quote, exceedingly delicate botanical specimens designated for delivery to Her Britannic Majesty's own royal gardens at Kew. It was a lie. Those were fully viable seeds, and Wickham knew exactly what they were worth. They arrived at Kew Gardens in London on June 15, 1876. Only 2,700 germinated, but it was enough. Those seedlings were shipped to British colonies in Southeast Asia. By 1895, a botanist named Henry Ridley had convinced coffee growers in Singapore to plant hevea trees. By 1913, cultivated Asian rubber surpassed Brazilian wild rubber in volume. The plantations were efficient, organized, and cheap, and Brazil simply couldn't compete. By 1914, Brazil's market share had collapsed to 30%. By 1918, 20%. By 1940, a devastating 1.3%. The Brazilian rubber economy imploded. The Teatro Amazonas stood empty and abandoned by 1921. Governor Eduardo Ribeiro had once boasted, "I started with a town and turned it into a modern city." Now that modern city was a ghost of itself. The champagnes stopped flowing. The Bugattis rusted. The laundry stayed in Manaus. In Brazil, Henry Wickham is still called a biopirate. Some historians argue the label is unfair, pointing out that the 19th century was an era of open exchange of plant materials. But Wickham wasn't exactly forthcoming about what he was doing, and the consequences reshaped the global economy. Manaus eventually found a second life. In 1967, the Brazilian government designated it a duty-free zone. Today, more than 600 companies operate there, including Nokia, Honda, Samsung, and Harley-Davidson. The free trade zone generated over 200 billion reais in 2024 and supports over 800,000 jobs. Manaus is now the sixth largest economy in Brazil. And the Teatro Amazonas? After a gap of almost 90 years, it reopened for live opera in 1997. Vogue magazine named it one of the most beautiful opera houses in the world. It now hosts the annual Amazonas Opera Festival and is home to the Amazonas Philharmonic Orchestra, 39 of whose 54 members come from Bulgaria, Belarus, and Russia. The rubber boom lasted barely 3 decades, but it turned a jungle outpost into a metropolis, built an opera house that still takes your breath away, created fortunes that defied imagination, and left behind a trail of suffering that took a century to even begin acknowledging. In 2012, the Colombian government officially apologized for the atrocities of the rubber era, though as one account noted, the apology did not reach the ears of many of the people whose lives are still marked by that upheaval. Manaus remains. The Opera House remains. And the story of what rubber did to the Amazon, both the splendor and the savagery, remains one of the most extraordinary chapters in the history of global capitalism. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.